Hey guys, how's it going? Jasensation here, and welcome back to the fourth rendition of your masterclass. I am your instructor, Jasensation, and I'm here today to present to you guys a masterclass on Feel the Rush. This is your classic SI Frej control deck, and has been pretty high requested since the last video I made for it. So I really want to take this moment to really do a deep dive onto the deck, really explain how it works, how to play it efficiently, and how to pilot a deck to the best that you can. So sit in, strap up, and grab a snack, because we're going to dive right into it. Alright, so we're going to start with the deck list overview. I won't spend too much time on this because we did go over this in the last video, but very basically, to any of you who have never really seen this deck before or any variant of an SI forward control deck, this deck is mainly jam-packed with all the removal you can get. You notice that we only run 7 units and 5 champions, so a total of 12 units, and the rest are spells and landmarks. The point of this deck isn't really to play early game, get chip damage in there, or like try to pressure down your opponent. The goal of the game is to survive until you play Field Rush, until you play Ledros, and then end the game really quickly. So that means for turns 1 through 8, 9, what you want to do is to be using your removal turn after turn to minimize the damage that you take from the opponent and clear the board the best that you can. And Frej plus SI is the best region combination for that. It has very flexible tools in cards like Vile Feast, Ice Shards, the Freezes, the Avalanche, the Box, the Whales, and the single target and big removal targets like Vengeance and Ruination. For our finishers, we do have some of the classic FTR champions as Trundle and Tryndamere. They're very good because they have good stat lines and they block very well, and they just have Overwhelm once they level up, so you gotta close out the game really fast. We have one of Ledros as well. Ledros is pretty good actually, being able to gum up the board state and to end the game a lot faster if you only have one of your champions and you can just have your opponent's health total. So let's talk a little bit about the mulligans. This deck's mulligans are quite different, I would say. It's a lot harder to just tell you that you can always keep certain cards. So I want you guys to look at this deck a little bit differently in order to figure out how you can best mulligan for it. And because the deck is so centered around removal in all the early turns, we are going to think about our mulligan as if we are thinking about removal. And this is a little bit simplistic in how you want to think about it, but I think it's a good frame of mind in how to approach the scenario. So this does require a good understanding of your opponent's decks and knowing what sort of removal is effective against them. So when we think about a deck like Spiders, they have a lot of X ones, like the Precious Pet, the Stygian, things like that, the Spiderlings. So the main question you want to ask yourselves when you play against a deck like that is, does my opponent play 1 health units? And we have some very good answers for 1 health units, such as Vile Feast, Ice Shard, Withering Wail. When your opponent starts playing 2 health units, so if we look at Kennen Ahri, they play the Navori, look out, the 2/2 elusive, whatever it is, and other things like that, or like Yoron Arms, they play the 3/2 Bomber Twins, and more chunkier units as well. So the good answers for decks that do run 2 health units are cards like Avalanche, Blighted Ravine, even like the Box. Moving forward, if your opponent is more of like a mid-range deck, they play bigger, beefier units, then cards like Vengeance and Ruination become a lot more efficient answers. That doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be keeping cards like Vengeance or Ruination, but it's to say that cards like Vile Feast against a deck like Pantheon is a really poor keep because it just doesn't remove anything. If we want to be thinking about our cards, again, we want to be thinking about what in terms that they do for us as a form of removal, and if they don't fit the deck that we're playing against, then they aren't cards that we need to consider keeping in the mulligan. So for the same reason you wouldn't keep Vile Feast against Pantheon, you wouldn't keep Vengeance against Spiders. Now, there are going to be matchups where your opponent's not going to really apply a lot of pressure to you. Maybe they're another slow control deck. Maybe they're like Kindred Viego or Darkness or something like that. And then you need to ask yourself, if my opponent doesn't really play units, then, well, I don't really need removal. And that's in the slower matchups where now you can start keeping your win conditions. Trund on 5 looks pretty appealing. You can even keep like Ramp, like Catalyst of Aeons to play on turn 3. You can then start greeding a little bit, maybe potentially keeping Ledros or Field Rush, because those are going to be the main win conditions of your game. So when you want to be thinking about the mulligan, again, think about what's effective against your opponent, ditch those cards that aren't effective, and look for ones that are better. Let's start off with what's probably a little bit of a simpler mulligan. This is against a spiders deck, and you really want early removal in this kind of matchup. You want your Vile Feast, your Ice Shards, your Withering Wails, and your Avalanches. And anything that aren't those are probably able to be kicked out. So the immediate mulligan targets are Catalyst and Tryndamere. I don't really want those in my hand. And the only last consideration is whether or not I want to keep Avrosh and Sentry. This is an interesting one because generally against aggro decks, early blockers are pretty good. This being able to trade for like a Legion, Saboteur, or like the 3/2 that can't block, those are okay. What I don't want to happen is for this Avrosh and Sentry to not be able to block anything because the Spiders deck actually runs a lot of fearsome units in their deck. And realizing this, a card like Withering Wail, Avalanche are just a lot better than Avrosh and Sentry, and so ultimately I decided to kick the Avrosh and Sentry, knowing that there's not actually that many units I want to block with it, and I want to look for a better card. My ending mulligan is definitely a lot worse. I end up with a Tryndamere again, Ledros, and Field Rush. This is definitely much worse than, I really wish I had Avrosh and Sentry. But I still stand by my decision, and I think that mulling the Avrosh and Sentry to look for a removal card instead of having a blocker that can't really block Fearsomes is correct. The next mulligan we have here is against Ahri Kennen. This one is also a very interesting matchup because they are so reactive. They go wide, they play a lot of units, but they are a lot slower. And so we really want to just be able to set up a lot of forks so we can stall out the game a lot. And we're just looking for early removal and ways of wiping out boards or making their developments awkward. Immediately, I see Withering Wail and Blighter Ravine. Those are pretty good at just making my removal very, very annoying, and I kick the Three Sisters as well as the Avarosian Sentry again. Avarosian Sentry, the early chip damage doesn't really matter. It can't block elusives, and the Three Sisters, the freeze could be good on like a leveled Ahri down the line, but in its current state, I'm really just looking for board clears. So Ice Shards, Withering Wails, Avalanche, Blighter Ravine, Box, all those cards are really good. I end up with 2 units instead, so pretty much just like no real big difference in the outcome of the mulligan, but look, keeping Whale, keeping Ravine to set up annoying forks, or to be able to pressure my opponent into slowing down their development. So for our next mulligan, we have against Darkness. So our opening hand here is Avarosian Sentry, Kindling Tavern Keeper, Ledros, and Field Rush. This is an interesting matchup where they don't really have that many early units. Tempo is definitely an important factor for them. Them playing the 3/4s, the Catalyst, the Conchologist. They have a little bit of a swarm setup, but ultimately their ability to pressure us isn't that impressive. And so in this matchup, I really want to look for some of my win conditions. I do already get Ledros and Field Rush. I have a Sentry, I have a Tavern Keeper. The outcome of this mulligan is a little bit interesting. I keep everything besides the Kindly Tavern Keeper, knowing that removal in this matchup isn't actually that good. They don't actually play that many units or go very wide onto board. I do keep the Avarosian Sentry just as a blocker for if he has a potential catalyzer on turn 2. I do need a 2 damage unit to be able to remove that, or at least have like a Vile Feast or like an Avalanche. But when we consider this matchup, Withering Wail, pretty useless card, Ice Shard, pretty useless card, Vile Feast, pretty useless card. Even like Avalanche and Ravine, you need to stack 2 of them in order to be able to deal with like a Vega or anything like that. And ultimately, their deck doesn't actually have a really good answer to Field Rush. So if I'm able to just drag out the game a little bit and then just have Field Rush as soon as I can, that's actually going to be really good for me in my ability to pressure the game out. So in this matchup, removal is actually not actually that good. I kick the Tavern Keeper and I pick up an Avalanche. Next mulligan we have here is against Viego Kindred. So this is definitely a very, very slow matchup. They really don't apply a lot of pressure and really accelerate around the turns 5, 6, 7 when they play a Hydrovine and Viego. Again, knowing that their deck does not really fall into the Ice Shard Ravine range, we really want our Vengeance as our Ruination, this kind of matchup where they just have a lot of bigger units. And because they are a lot slower, these cards just don't serve early purpose at all. And so in this matchup, I really want some of my later game cards. I'm happy keeping Trundle here. I want to find Vengeance, I want to find Ruination, I want to find some hard removal in this matchup. Overall, this matchup is very unfavored for us, so there's not really much we can do here besides just look for some of our better cards. In this case, we got a second Trundle, Ledros, and Box. This hand's just not that great overall. Trundle is at least a good turn 5 play, and we picked up a Vengeance, which is good. But realizing that, you know, your regular standard anti-aggro cards are useless in this matchup is really important in mulliganing correctly in these scenarios. And for the final mulligan here, we have a matchup against Kindred Sentinels. This one's a little bit interesting because they do have a lot of early pressure, but their units aren't very easily removable by cards like Withering Wail or Vile Feast. So if we think about what kind of units they want to play their Sentinels, the 1-2, the 3-3, and Elise, the 2-3. So their early game comprises mostly of units with 2 or greater health, which means that a card like Withering Wail or Vile Feast doesn't actually count as much removal at all. Or like Avalanche is a lot better in removing some of the early board. And they, without any units to slay on our side, their early game doesn't actually scale as quickly as it can. So we have Catalyzer, Field Rush, Ruination, Vile Feast. Vile Feast is pretty useless here, but you know, an early Ruination on turn like 6 or 7, or like a ramp on turn 3 into like an early Field Rush is something that this deck just really can't stop. And so this hand is actually like quite good. We aren't going to be feel too pressured early on if we do draw like an Avalanche. That does help clean things up. And we always have this Ruination, a little bit of healing to back us up as well. So, but in this deck, I think, or in this matchup, I think it's important to realize that a card like Withering Wail or Vile Feast just doesn't really serve much purpose because there's nothing much it can kill. So now that we have the basic ideas of mulligans down, we know what kind of removal cards we need to keep, but the next question becomes when do we use them and when is the appropriate time to use them? And this becomes a great balancing act. And what I mean by this is we have two main resources in our deck. One is Nexus Health, and the other is our removal tools. If we go 1 for a lot of our removal, we're going to fall behind simply because our removal is quite expensive relative to what our opponent can do to develop. So if we Vile Feast every 1 health unit, if we Avalanche every single 2 health unit, and we're not really going to gain any advantage from it. And so we need to ration out our resources in order to use them into our opponent so that we're getting 2 for 1s, we're getting 3 units for an Avalanche. We're burning our opponent's mana if we play Ravine. And so we really need to think about when the best moment to use them is, how I can pair them together with each other, because our removal is very damage oriented. If a unit has 3 health, a unit has 4 health, and suddenly we don't really have cards to deal with them, and we have to use a combination of cards to deal with them. So there's a lot of factors into when and how you want to use removal, because it's not so simple as just killing everything on site. The good news is, with our deck, we have a lot more health to work with. We have a lot of healing within our deck, namely cards like Kyling Tavern Keeper, Catalyst of Aeons, Withering Wail, Vile Feast. We have easily 20 plus points of health that we can actually heal, essentially doubling our Nexus health. So even against an aggro deck, against a burn deck, we don't mind taking a little bit of early damage early on in order to set up better removal options for our deck. What I mean by this is you don't necessarily want to Vile Feast every 1 health unit. Maybe if you want to cast a Withering Wail down the line, you save that Vile Feast to ping like a 2 health unit because you know Withering Wail would deal with the rest. This concept might sound a little bit foreign to you guys at first, but I promise that we'll go through a lot of examples and I'll really show you how this balancing act really works. But the main takeaway here is, and probably the most important takeaway here is, to be very, very reactive with your removal. You want to be using removal as late as you can, especially because a lot of our removal is actually at fast speed. We can use a lot of them during combat and use our slow removal as more of a development punisher. But I think for this section, the best frame of mind to how reactive we want to be is if our opponent passes the turn and open attacks us, do we have an appropriate response to that? And if the answer is yes, then we can be reactive as possible because then they'll be forced to develop first. So let's dive into some examples and I'll show you guys what I really mean by how and when to use our removal. Let's jump back to that spider game. One of our top decks is this Avarocian Sentry. Our opponent's board currently is the Legion Saboteur, as well as the Elise. So there's two main decisions that we have within this turn. The first one is, do we want to play Vile Feast on the 2-1, or do we want to play the Sentry? This is a little bit interesting because I think a lot of players here will opt towards playing the Vile Feast onto the Legion Saboteur. This not only prevents dealing 1 damage from the Legion Saboteur, but also gives us Spiraling to trade into the 1-1 over here. And I think another important thing to notice is we have this Blighted Ravine, and we have to ask ourselves, how are we dealing with this Elise? The only way that we can deal with this Elise is to deal 2 damage to it with, say, like the Blighted Ravine, and then finish it off with either our Vile Feast or the Withering Wail that we top deck. We can pass here because his open attack isn't very threatening, and we can always bluff the fact that we have Avalanche. We don't want to play the I guess we could play the Tavern Keeper first, just as a good blocker for the Elise, but knowing that we can set up like a Blighted Ravine with the Vile Feast, we're not in that big of a rush here. So moving forward to the next turn, he takes the pass back, and he actually open attacks here. We force him into a position where he sort of needs to open attack, because if he develops, he gets punished by cards like Avalanche and things like that. Again, what's really important about this one is we don't play Ravine right away. We play the Tavern Keeper now because he still has 7 mana to work with. He is in a spot where he needs to develop, right? He can't just burn us down from 15 when we have so much healing within our deck. It's not very easy for him, and he's forced to develop. This is very important to realize, because Ravine is much better played on our attack turn, where he cannot develop into an open attack. And so I play this first. I say, okay, do you want to develop any more into my Ravine next turn? And he's going to be like, yeah, I have to. And he plays out Arachnoid Horror. So this flips Elise, which doesn't really matter in this matchup because we're just so removal focused. And this is good for us because we're putting him in a very awkward position where he's very scared to develop too much into our board clears, and B, we just jams Ravine the next turn, and suddenly now he just can't develop at all this turn. What this now does is it sets up the Elise to be killed by this top decked Ice Shard, this Withering Wail, or even this Vile Feast. And so by saving the Vile Feast from turn 2, we actually have an efficient way to actually deal with the last damage to this Elise. So this is the next turn. We top deck another Withering Wail, which if you've played this matchup at all, you know is one of the best cards in this deck. So he develops a House Spider. So we get a pass again because we have easy answers for the Elise. If he develops more, we can get him with a box. If he open attacks, we just like kill his Elise, and suddenly his attack is really insignificant, right? What you want to be doing with this deck very commonly is to be setting up these positions where the opponent feels like they can't develop and it feels like they can't open attack. So this is perfect. We can take as many passes as we want, because as long as we get to the late game, you see we have our Ledros, we have our Tryndamere in hand, we can easily stop our opponent from really doing anything. So I just Withering Wail here. It protects my Tavern Keeper, which his deck just can't really deal with at all. So this will be able to block in a future turn. And we kill the Elise. We let the Spider swing in for 2, but again, that's not very important. And you'll notice that he's developing a lot after his attacks because of how scared he is of my hand. It's very hard for him to develop into me, and it just forces him into these awkward turns. So jump a little bit ahead to pretty much the last turn in this game that actually really matters. This is our attack turn, so we develop this kindly Tavern Keeper because we're just so far ahead. At this point, our opponent is very low on cards. At this point, these cards most likely end up being burned. Even if they aren't burned, we're now ahead on board. And at this point, we can sort of be a little bit more free with how we spend our resources and how we spend our mana. We basically won this game. Well, technically we won it by like turns 4 or 5, where our opponent just really was forced into bad positions. And so now I just want to be a little bit more flexible with my mana, spend it as best as I can, and start to end the game. He has graciously set up with a perfect Withering Wail, while I would, as a good player, I would just save this Withering Wail for my defensive turn. When he attacks, this Withering Wail just completely destroys his attack. But I actually cast it here because now I'm getting cheeky with it. I want to push damage with my kindly Tavern Keepers and close out the game. At this point, I'm already winning, so playing like this is, not really going to make a difference to the outcome of the game. But now I'm being a little bit more efficient with my mana. I'm turning the table, and I'm saying I want to start ending the game and by applying pressure. And he forced out a Stygian on a defensive turn, which is not ideal at all. So for our next example, we have here a game against Kennen Ahri. This is a super reactive matchup. We have double Withering Wail, we have a Blighter Ravine as forms of removal, which are actually pretty good. So we don't really have much to go on with these turns. We're taking it very, very slow. We're taking very long passes, being very aggressive with how little we spend our mana, and we don't really want to do anything that we don't need to. This is the first interesting turn. So I think most people, they might just like play the sentry out in order to like pressure, either pressure trade, start dealing damage, but all that's just really not important. The most important thing in this matchup is two things: our Nexus health and our removal. We want to be as greedy as possible with our removal in order to pressure our opponent. And the way that that works is we want to use our removal when they spend more mana on their units. So this turn we could play Blighter Ravine and gank these two elusives. That's not a lot of value, and he still has 6 mana up to just save his elusives if he ever wants to. We want to use our removal in this specific matchup as stacked as we can, so combining 2 cards in one turn, so maybe like Withering Wail and a box, or box and the Ravine on the same turn, in order to pressure out his counterspells and his recalls. And so in this case, it's just not really worth it. He's not presenting a lot of pressure. If he wants to open attack and deal 4 damage to me, that's completely fine. If he wants to play like the Lookout, and then he wants to play into box and ravine, I pretty much get to clear his board. Again, this turn I could Withering Wail this, but he's only pushing 5 damage. I can be very, very passive with this and save my removal and resources when I can combine them together. Because if I just play Withering Wail out here and he denies it, well, I don't have any counter to it, and I want to counter when he has less mana up. And that's a very important factor with this matchup. He's making his developments very, very slow and awkward because I'm holding up so much mana, but this isn't the turn that I want to fight for these boards. And I gotta take it slow. I played Trundle. If he develops further, I have much better removal options when he has a much wider board. And what's actually really good here is he's played the Wayfinder. This is he's looking out for my mana points. I'm at 3 mana. I can no longer box him, which makes a card like Wayfinder good to play, right? Well, the thing is, I can simply play Ravine on my following turn, and now he's just developed so many elusives. Even with 9 mana, it's very difficult for him to save, all of them. And if this Ravine goes off and wipes the entire board here, that is very advantageous for me. So being very patient with my removal, waiting to set up for the right moment, and setting up these positions where my opponent has a lot of elusives on the board, and essentially by playing this Ravine, I put him in an awkward position where now he has to decide how many and which ones he needs to save. So let's fast forward to a later turn in this game. So this is turn, what it seems to be turn 9. My opponent is flipping Ahri this turn, but he's not actually presenting much threat here. This Withering Wail is a fine sort of like a softie. In this particular matchup, Deny is a very, very important resource. You see in our hand we have Field Rush, Atrocity, and this Vengeance, all which are pretty good Deny targets, which makes Withering Wail one of the less potent targets that you really want to use your Deny on. What's really good here is by casting this Withering Wail, it's threatening 2 of his elusives here. If it kills the Mourned, then Ahri no longer levels, and if it kills the Droplet, then Trundle gets a trade for the Ahri, right? So this is a good whale because it does 2 things at once. It prevents the Ahri level up, and it potentially threatens to kill Ahri at the same time. So our opponent has to do 2 things here. A, he needs to save the Droplet by buffing it with like a Twin, which is good for us because Twin used offensively on like an Ahri can be really threatening. B, he can stun the Trundle on a defensive turn, which is even better for us because then Trundle gets a swing, potentially uncontested. Or C, he buffs both of these, and that's a lot of resources out of him. And then if he taps too low on mana, we can then move in with like a second whale or a vengeance. And so I like this Withering Wail because A, it's low committal, and B, if he wants to get the best outcome of this sort of trade, he needs to invest quite a bit of resources. So what he ends up doing here is he simply just twins the droplet once he puts it on a stack. Any moment now. Oh no, sorry, he homecomings the droplet. And this is interesting because we can fight for this, right? We have a second whale, we can kill this if we want. But I think at this point it's very important to know when to fight for things, and this isn't our fight. If we want to whale and he twins, that is horrendous for us. That is beyond horrendous. Whale is such an important resource in these positions to really force things out like this, where we can't be wasting it to just ping down on this. We want to vengeance the droplet. That's actually like a likely possibility if we really wanted to, but I don't see a real point in doing that. So this forces out a homecoming on a defensive turn, so super good for us. And even if the Ahri flips here, which it does, it has no ability to actually hit and recall anything. So we see this, we're fine accepting, we do not fight for this. If we had like a Vile Feast, potentially we go for it, but without any other forms of efficient removal, that's just really not our fight to pick. Alright, so again, in the same game, jumping forward to turn 10. This is his attack turn again, and he plays Scattered Pod. What's really key about sort of what's going on, especially within this turn, is how expensive Scattered Pod is to play. We don't really care about what he tutored, it potentially is like the rally that this deck plays. But what's really important here is now he has 7 mana and we have 10 mana. This sort of exchange in mana points is very, very crucial in these sort of games, because now he can only cast Deny and maybe one other spell, right? Versus when we have 13 mana, we got to be a lot more flexible with the outcome of our situations. I think another important thing, especially within this matchup, is knowing when to stress out the Deny. I think a lot of players might say, oh, I will cast Field Rush on my attack turn to force out the Deny. And what happens is they deny the Field Rush, they develop, and then you lose, right? In this case, because he's already played Pod this turn, he's so stressed on mana that him casting a Deny here is actually good for us. What this means is if he needs to deny this atrocity, or either like he homecomings it, either way, a 4 mana spell to stop this atrocity, he goes to 3 mana, and then anything I play has a much higher desired outcome for my situation. Now, if he taps under 4 mana, he can't rally anymore, he can't deny anymore, and then he's locked to a card like Homecoming or like a recall or like a twin or things like that. And because I'm so ahead in this mana exchange, I feel a lot more confident in firing off this vengeance just to kill this 5/6, because I do need to kill this eventually, but stressing out the deny here is a lot better here because of how little mana he has. And the turn afterwards, I do want to stress this point again, we're both at 10 mana, we have equal mana points. I swing, I'm threatening lethal, and I'm threatening clear his board as well. So let's see what he does, and let's figure out what we want to do after the fact. So he goes here for what I believe to be a homecoming onto my Trundle. And I have an interesting spot here. I don't really have much to do with my turn. I could like pass, save up box for when he develops, or I can just fire off this atrocity. Again, I think really want you guys to consider the mana points, right? If he plays deny here, which he needs in order to stop my atrocity, he can't do anything for the rest of his turn, which means that I have no need to hold up the box. And so either he has deny and he stops my atrocity for the turn, or he doesn't and I win. Again, putting him in positions where him needing to play a card like Deny or Homecoming really just threatens his total mana usage of the turn and puts me in at least a not bad situation, is really key. And he ended up not having the Deny and this atrocity goes through. So the last final example I want to look over, I want this game against Yoron Arms. I think this is an interesting one because right now if we look at our current hand, we are limited to this Avalanche and this Vile Feast. This Ruination is a little bit off, but we don't really have, in terms of removal, we have very little. We top this Atrocity, which means that it's pretty much a dead card for the foreseeable future. Which means we have to make this Avalanche count. This Avalanche is really effective against his deck, but we need to milk it so that we can set up the best scenario for ourselves. This is a little bit interesting because, again, we could Vile Feast the 2/1, block the Telescope, and essentially nullify his attack. But realizing that we're setting up for this Avalanche to some future turn, we don't really need to remove any of these 2/1s from the board. And I think that's important to realize when you're low on removal and resources, in this case, which I am. Being able to play a little bit more conservatively with our removal is quite important. I think you could easily just play these anyways and just kind of get away with it, but I am being as careful as I can with my resources to not mismanage them. Because even if he does have a board at some point and he casts Yordle Arms to try to clear things up, we always do have this Ruination to fall back on. Attack there because we know we're going to Avalanche. We see this Yordle Captain. This Yordle Captain is priority number 1. If this Yordle Captain starts buffing things like 3 health, well then suddenly, wow, this Avalanche is looking really bad. So our essential plan here is, now that we've seen this Yordle Captain come down, we want to play Blighted Ravine into Avalanche in order to clear up the Yordle Captain. Moving forward, we have a future turn in the game where my hand is actually very, very awkward. We have a Vile Feast and a Withering Wail, a Vengeance, and a Ruination. In this matchup, Vengeance is quite poor. Its only real targets are the Yordle Captain, which now it no longer has an option. And so we have Vile Feast and Withering Wail. So I think this mouse over was pretty cool. Not cool in the sense of cool, but it was a cool that we had this decision to make and we chose not to do it. Because let's go back a little bit. So when we hover over this Vile Feast, we're like, okay, I want to kill the mayor to set up a block for these guys. But again, I'm so limited on removal. I'm considering just wailing to kill this 3-1. And that's like pretty okay, right? And so again, we play as slow as we can, and we force our opponent into doing things first. In which case, he decides to play Sign-In, and suddenly this is a excellent Ruination, and we get rewarded for being slow with our turns. If we cast the Vile Feast, maybe he doesn't go for this, maybe he develops further, or maybe like, I don't know, he open attacks on that turn and we can just like wail, take it a little bit slower as well, but this outcome was good for us because we're a little bit more patient. And the last turn I want to take a look here is this turn, where he's attacking with 9 mana up, which I think is very strange to look at. So against his deck, you know, he doesn't really have much after development he really wants to be doing. Potentially he has some sort of burn that I do need to look out for. And the last option that he potentially has is a Fizz spell, which if you guys don't know what it does, is he is able to cast it on one of his units and essentially rally. And so I don't want to be in a position where I'm taking too much damage that he can burn me out, because if I just pass here, he deals 8 damage and then I most likely die to burn. And so I'm most likely thinking, okay, I need to remove at least this unit, which I have the whale for, but then I also need to be careful about a second Fizz spell. If I'm able to clear like this unit and potentially one more unit, then suddenly the Fizz spell doesn't really do much into my Trundle and my Pillar. So realizing this, I go for the Vengeance onto Lulu, and I Withering Wail to pop the spell shield and kill the 4-1. Against their deck, they don't have any combat tricks or any way to actually save their units. So when this Withering Wail deals 1 to this 4-1, it will always deal 1 to this 4-1. There's no exception unless he has some randomly generated buff, but this will guarantee the kill on this. We're minimizing as much damage as we can. Even if he wants to rally onto like the Fizz, he's attacking into the Trundle, or like, you know, just dealing 4 damage with an elusive Fizz. We're healing 4 here, and we're looking to threaten to close the game. He chooses not to cast Yordle Arms if he did have it, maybe afraid of like another Ruination or anything like that. But again, because we're playing so reactively, we're playing so slowly, we're able to set ourselves up for these good positions. Now that you understand how to control the board, what to mulligan for, how to use it efficiently, and now you finally did it. You survived to the late game, where you are on turn 9, turn 10, whatever it may be. Now you're jamming the big boys, you're setting up the big threats. You have Field Rush, you have Legends, you have the Atrocity, it's time to end the game. And it's a little bit more complicated than just casting Field Rush and swinging and hoping that it works. Although that will work in a lot of cases, I will teach you to look at the board, the hand, and how you can set up an even bigger threat. This is mainly with the help of cards like Ledros and Atrocity, you know, maybe with like Fear of the North or things like that. But what's really key about our deck in particular is how annoying and inefficient it is to remove our threats after we have casted a card like Field Rush. And what I mean by this is Trundle being a 10-10 region, Tryndamere being a 10-10 tough that, you know, not, well, it doesn't have tough, but it gets to come back after it dies once, meaning that you have to kill it twice, essentially, makes it very inefficient to actually deal with. Within the current meta, there are essentially 0 decks outside of, just casting Deny on Field Rush. After Field Rush is casted and your champions are summoned, there are really pretty much no decks that can efficiently deal with Field Rush. If they have Ruination, they leave up a level Tryndamere. If they have Vengeance, they leave up a Tryndamere. If they, like, they'd have to like double mini morph to efficiently, like, answer 12 mana for 12 mana. And what that means is we can use this to our advantage and set up even stickier boards. Because Ledros coming down, if they ruinate Ledros, it comes back to hand, they're not essentially dealing with a threat, they're leaving up a Tryndamere, now they have like 9 less health than they had beforehand. Or they just don't have another fearsome block, you have the pillars to be able to drag things out of the way. And suddenly you're threatening the whole lot more because you decided to develop your threats even more to make your board even stickier. And of course we have Atrocity at the very end, just to act as a haha. You can't tap under a certain mana point now that you're within Atrocity range. All these combine together to make really threatening board states and to help you win a little bit faster and easier. So let's show a little few examples of what I mean, how aggressively we can get with this, when it's correct to develop, why you don't really need to keep up mana after a certain point. Because I think to a lot of control players, a lot of the mindset is I don't want to tap out. But in certain scenarios, when you're going for the win, not tapping out, or like tapping out, spent like using all your mana, sometimes isn't really even a problem. So I'll show you some examples of what I'm talking about, and let's just check it out. Alright, so let's take a look at this first example. The turns are ending. This is against Darkness. We have just cast Field Rush on our turn 9 defensive turn, and we're going into turn 10 with the attack token. So the question is, what do we do and how do we close the game? I think the first very obvious thing that we want to do is start off the turn by playing Ice Pillar. This levels our Trundle, gives it Overwhelm. Actually, what's also really good is it grants the Veigar vulnerable, so we can pull the Veigar and kill it as well this turn. But I think the first obvious thing is the first flip Trundle, so now it becomes an even bigger threat. We also want to look at his mana point. He's at 10 mana, right? So like, what can he do if we play this Ledros? I think you always want to be asking yourselves when you are in this position where you're forcing to win the game, what is the worst thing that could happen to us, and we play around it. So in this point, we have these two attackers and he has 10 mana up. If he's able to Vengeance the Trundle and it dies, then we're not pushing lethal. Doesn't mean that we can't not push lethal on our next attack turn, but with a leveled Veigar on board, maybe he has the ability to just darkness us down. Now we do have the ability to, say, cast Entomb onto the Veigar. That's not really that big of an issue necessarily, but we're looking for ways to end the game, and he can't stop this Ledros, right? So let's just think about it really quickly. At 10 mana, he can only kill 1 unit. Realistically, he can only kill 1 unit. He can like mini morph something, he can vengeance something, but realistically, that's all he's got. And so with 3 threats now on the board after we played Ledros, with him only being able to remove 1 of them, and the fact that he has no fearsome blocker, this Ledros is presenting lethal just by itself, not to mention the 20 plus damage of Overwhelm that we have, not to mention that we're also threatening to kill Veigar. This is like a triple threat. And so he's forced to play a fearsome blocker, which he ends up playing this Ixtali Sentinel, tapping him down to 4 mana, meaning he can no longer move a single threat on my board as well, meaning that we can go in here pretty freely, and whatever outcome happens, we're either in a very overwhelming board advantage position where he has lost all of his threats, or B, we just win. So he's forced to block the Ledros here, his Veigar is forced to die, and he's still dying. So he has to play his stress defense here onto the Trundle, but even so, he's losing his Veigar, we have overwhelming board advantage, there's no real way he can kill us, and we've set up a board advantage state where it really highly benefits us, just because we played Ledros on that turn on the attack. So this game is another example of a very similar fundamental that happened in the Darkness game, where our opponent has 1 fearsome blocker, and that 1 fearsome blocker is vulnerable. So now there's like a few different things we could actually do here. We could like, attack with Trundle and then Ledros and then play Ledros and then Atrocity, or we just play Ledros now. There's no real point in keeping up our mana. He can't really remove Trundle with his deck unless he has like triple Get Excited, double Get Excited plus Mystic Shot, and if he does have that sort of exact hand, then there's more of a reason to develop into it. And so if he's able to kill one of our units, we might as well play a second one that he has to deal with, right? Because in this position, I'm able to pull the Fearsome Blocker away. Again, Ledros is dealing lethal damage, so A, he has to play another Fearsome Blocker, or B, he has to kill one of my 2 units here. And again, this is setting up a position that only favors us, whereas in his turn, because I know he has no real ways of punishing us, this is the correct play, realizing that even as a control deck against aggro deck, tapping out for this entire turn is not consequential to us at all. And so I believe he ends up just double Get Exciting my Ledros, I put him down to 1 health, and then I Atrocity and so this last clip, I want to talk about what is actually a mistake in what I've made. I'm setting up this attack against Kindred Viego Ionia, which, while is an unfavored matchup, we're actually in an okay position here. And here's what I think is quite a critical mistake. So I end up not attacking with the Trundle because even if it trades into the Hydrovine, he could potentially have a card like Spirit's Refuge. And if that trade happens onto the Trundle, that's really bad for us. We lose the Trundle for free, we don't have a response to it, and he's able to just gain a trade here. But what I've accidentally done here is I pulled with Tryndamere instead of the Trundle. And why I believe this is a mistake is because he is able to kill my Tryndamere here and proc its ability on level up to resurrect, essentially. So I was afraid of like a twin Vile Feast onto the Trundle, but I ultimately think that protecting the Tryndamere was a little bit important, because what this means is in the future, when I cast a card like Feel the Rush, this Tryndamere will now come out leveled, meaning that it doesn't get a second death on proc. And so because he is able to kill this Tryndamere, any future Tryndamere I play is essentially a lot weaker, especially into a Shadow Isles kind of deck, where now Ruination will just clear the board. The last thing I want to cover with this deck is its tech cards. This deck is very, very flexible in how it wants to play its cards, what kind of cards wants to fit in, or just looking to target, things like that. My current list has an Ice Shard, has 2 boxes, so it's a little bit more tech against a deck like Kennen Ahri? What the heck? Ahri Kennen. But let's talk a little bit about how you can tech the deck into certain matchups. And here are just some few basic ones that come off to mind and are popular within the meta. So the first one is against Pantheon. Pantheon is a much more mid-range focused deck. They play a lot more singular units that go bigger with buffs and things like that. So cards like Flash Freeze, Vengeance, and Ruination are really key in those matchups. You can potentially bump up to 3 Vengeances, 2 Ruinations, a second Flash Freeze, things like that. Cards that would be useless in those situations are cards like Vile Feast, maybe even like Avalanche. You could go down to 2 of them if you're really focused on beating up Pantheon. On the flip side, against Ahri Kennen, a lot more cards that are board clears, just the board sweepers like Ice Shard and Box are really important. Having extra copies of these cards can make it very annoying for the Kennen Ahri player to develop into their attacks, which gives you a little bit more reactivity and flexibility. Cards that are really awful in that matchup are cards like Feel the Rush, where you really essentially can't play them into a deny, otherwise you get punished really hard for it. So that's like cards you can cut, right? When you think about these tech cards, there are good tech cards you can add in each matchup, but you can also think about what cards are bad in each matchup and take those out in response for some of these. And then finally, there are some more varied techs. These have their slight niches. A card like Passage Unearned, really good into Thralls, maybe you could swing an entire matchup just by putting in 1 or 2 of these. Into slower, more controlling meta of decks, you can put in Callus of Aeons, so that we can ramp up to our Feel the Rush earlier, or our Tryndamere, or our Trundle, or our Ledros. And then there's also cards like Howling Abyss, where I don't know if this is actually a serious tech card or not, but if you're really looking to outgrind somebody, a deck that has like triple Vengeance, double Ruination, like all the denies in the world or whatever it may be, and you need a little bit more value, you can always tech this in for like a very, very slow and grindy game. Although I don't think it's really good, but it's just an idea we have here. Other cards can be like Iceveil Archers, Glimpse Beyond, anything like that. There's so many kind of tech cards within these two colors to really fit the niche that you're looking for. So there's definitely a lot of room to play around with it, but make sure that you pick you focus on one or two decks. You see that the tech cards against Pantheon and Kennen Ahri are vastly different, and you can't really tech your deck into both of them without losing out on one of them, right? Because cards like Ice Shard and Box are really bad against Pantheon, but Vengeance and Ruination are really bad against Ahri, we can't just like try to split our deck into trying to do both without, making it slightly weaker into either side. Now you could, but I think that would highly depend on your matchups as well as your lineup. So you have reached the end of the masterclass. I hope that this was a helpful lesson to help you better understand and pilot Feel the Rush as a deck. This is very transferable to pretty much any other SI Frej Control deck because they all play the similar tools within it. I will caution that not all control decks would want to play in this sort of style. A lot of control decks are a little bit more tempo oriented, need to develop units on a board, things like that, whereas our deck really doesn't care about that until the late turns. But hopefully this deck has, or this video has helped you just understand these concepts a little bit better. If you guys want to see some videos or some games within this deck, I will include one or two of them at the end of here. I know this video is already super long, so I don't want to drag it on for too long, but I will also link the games that I played earlier in the video I made earlier in the description down below. But if you did enjoy this video, I would highly appreciate it if you left a like and a subscribe to the channel. This does take a lot of effort to make, but I really enjoy making them because I think they're very helpful. So if you did enjoy, please let me know what you liked the best and what you'd want to see a masterclass on in the future. I'll try to make these as often as I can, but it really depends on what you guys want to see. So just let me know and enjoy some of the games, and if you want more games, more in the description down below. But this has been Jasensation, and I will catch you guys with the next one.